Hello, my friends. Here I go again with someone that I have the privilege to work when I was living in the UK, Mark Jenkins. We worked together at the Ogilvy. I was a freelancer for 6 months working for Unilever, and I've learned a lot with Mark. Mark, thanks a lot for having the time to speak with me and help me to learn again and my skills and lapidate my skills and refurbish to be a strategist again on an agency.
Welcome, Rafa. Welcome. Lovely to see you again.
And to start, tell a little bit about your career. So why did you choose to be a strategist and how did you start and what have you done so far?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. And we probably don't have long enough in this podcast to go through the twists and turns of my career. I guess I could trace it all the way back to when I was doing my degree. Uh, and in particular, in the last couple of years in the UK, you're asked to specialize in particular subjects. So I did a business studies degree. And within that, I chose to specialize in strategy and marketing. And there were a couple of professors that I had. Professor Robert East, who was part of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and an early exponent of understanding consumer behavior. And there was another professor, Rob Matthews, who was very much focused on broader business strategy. And sort of the intersection of those two disciplines was something that always fascinated me. Always look forward to those lectures and those the learning that came from just being in the same sort of room as those two gentlemen. And then from there, I've kind of had a few twists and turns in my career, from starting out agency side, a move then into consultancy. And since then, probably a 50-50 split between being in client side roles and agency side roles, which is where you and I met, and I spent the last almost decade. But I suppose what's been the driving factor behind those various twists and turns has always been a natural curiosity and a desire to do new things, unlock growth in new ways to new audiences, et cetera, et cetera. So I think probably that sense of being comfortable, being uncomfortable in the not knowing, being naturally curious, and I suppose wanting to be leading change rather than sort of being told to change have been the key factors that have pushed me into this sort of line of work.
That's great. And talking about change that you've mentioned, what has changed on the last 5 years, 6 years, because now it's been a little longer than what it was before, because it was a
Yeah.
partner, creative agency partner at Meta. So it was great to talk about insights and benchmarks on the creativity on Meta's assets and things around that, but it was more focused on Meta's assets, which was
Mm.
great. I was helping
Yeah.
the creative agencies to think about how to digitally and mobile first create their ideas and their campaigns. But I was not inside of an agency. So for a
Yeah.
strategist inside of an agency, what has changed on the last 5 years on the work of a strategist?
Probably not much has changed up until sort of November, December of last year. And now it feels like everything is changing all the time, all at once. But underpinning that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I think underpinning that, the core principles of strategy haven't changed. It's just our access to data, the speed with which we can get to that data, and the way within an agency that we come to formulate propositions, formulate ideas, build the creative executions that ultimately get in front of consumers. And I think certainly over the last decade, certainly over the last 5 years, all of the walls that used to exist between departments, and certainly the veil that strategists used to hide under of being sort of the cleverest person in the room and nobody should bother them, all of those have started to disappear, and for the better, I think. So I'm finding that although I'm very comfortable working collaborative and always have been, that's being dialed up radically now. So I'm working with creatives almost at the very beginning of a brief rather than waiting to present my strategy to them on carved tablet of stone and wait for their applause. I am sort of involving them from the very outset. I think also the involvement of people at all levels as well has changed. There is no hierarchy within agencies as such anymore, particularly within strategy and creative, where a good idea can come from anyone. I think there has been a welcome humbling of the role of the strategist, and a much more open opinion, an open attitude to the involvement of others as well. That said, I think, it still needs the discipline of understanding the commercial context or the commercial outcome that you're trying to achieve, a deep understanding of consumers and culture. So what is the context that you're playing into and that you're trying to have some small influence over to drive the outcome that you're after, and then the role of creativity throughout the process. Creativity in all the agencies I've worked at, and I've been fortunate enough to work in some really good ones with some outstanding people, is not the sole purview of the ECD, the Executive Creative Director. Everybody is encouraged to think differently and be brave and courageous in how they think, in order to try and accelerate the growth objectives of the brands that we work on. So that's sort of a broad overview of the last 5 years. I think within the last 5 months, however, sort of artificial intelligence has kind of come along and supercharged all of those conversations. Just recently, I'll give you a couple of examples of how we're using that for 2 global clients. For one, the client had a fairly limited understanding of who their consumer audience was or should be. So we used a combination of, our own insights, market data, but just sort of writing prompts to ChatGPT to try and help stimulate some thinking about where growth could come from, and what that might look like, the kind of audience. As a consequence of that, we went away and created a brand new consumer muse that creatively we would pin the brand's growth to for the next 3 years or so, which was something that you will be familiar with. We've done, as a strategy department, as a strategy discipline for years, trying to really understand who our consumer audience is. But with ChatGPT, what we were able to do is to build in multiple different dimensions to that audience and ask questions of the bespoke GPT that we'd created. That gives us some insight, further insight into how this audience thinks, what they do, and what some of the levers might be that we could use to communicate with them. So the kind of messages, the kind of moments, and the kind of sort of media that we could be in order to reach and effectively communicate with this audience. So that's been something that has been super interesting to do. And again, I think we're using this to assist our thinking rather than to replace our thinking. So I know before we jumped on this, you said sort of, is ChatGPT coming for our jobs? Possibly is the answer in a few years' time. But certainly at the moment, I think there is still much need for human interaction with AI in order to engineer better outcomes that feel more human. And then the second example that I'll give you is, again, recently we produced a number of different creative territories for another global brand that we wanted a read on to see, would those resonate with a particular audience. Normally this would take sort of a month, 2 weeks to 4 weeks in order to do. So to get the ideas in front of the eyes of consumers, to get their feedback, to understand what that meant, and then to form a conclusion. We were able to reach 300 people, very specifically targeted in a different market to the UK, which is where I sit. And we were able to get both a quantitative read and a qualitative read across 20 different variables within 24 hours. Yeah, so it also had the benefit for the client of being a lot cheaper than commissioning traditional research. And it allowed us to pivot on some of the creative work before even a client presentation. And it also had the benefit for us of giving us data to go in and communicate with clients when they sort of typically say, well, we like a bit of option one, a bit of option two, and maybe throw in a little bit of option three and come back in a couple of weeks and tell us, show us the new creative work. We were able to give them very specific consumer insights into the creative work, which takes an element of client and agency subjectivity out of deciding what creative should run. So those are just two examples in the last sort of quarter of how we're starting to use AI to improve the way that we think and act as strategists and as an agency.
But as you mentioned, the prompts are the conversation that you have depending on the prompts that our human brain makes, and then the next prompt that you make as well, depending on the answer of ChatGPT and how you do. That's perfect. And about the insight, I know the 4 C's, of course. I know that McCann has more 7 C's, I believe. But what's the best way? What are the best ways to grab beyond the consumer insight, but the culture insight, the company insight, the category insight? Category insight, of course, I imagine doing the desk research. I'm looking a lot for the data, but the company insights and the culture insight. What are the best ways to grab those?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think my honest answer would be you have to immerse yourself in the culture that you want to understand, and very often within agencies at the moment, it feels like every brief we're getting is for a Gen Z audience. And to be honest, as somebody who's not Gen Z but is the father to 2 Gen Zers, I often ask my kids or observe what my kids are doing. But then we also have people within the agencies who are living that lifestyle. And I think the best way is to observe what they're doing and to ask them interesting questions about what they do and why they do what they do. You can take that into many of the online resources that exist. You can commission your own research as well if you want a more robust sample size. But as a start point, as a strategist, we'll probably look to people near to you to get an initial read, and then take it from there. I think in the UK, there is a bias as well to be very London centric, and probably that's replicated in every market. There will be certain cities which are sort of cultural hubs where agencies tend to exist, where you may come up with sort of slightly cliched versions of what the culture actually is. So in the UK, we sort of semi jokingly say, well, let's go to Shoreditch to look for what the cool kids are doing. In the US, I'm sure it's like, let's go to Brooklyn to look at what the cool kids are doing. But I think part of the job of a strategist is to get out into the wider community, and to understand what people outside of those big centers are doing. And I remember some, not amongst Gen Z, but amongst a much older audience, researching habits of tea drinking, which you might think an English person shouldn't have to do because it's so ingrained in our culture, but traveling the length and breadth from north to south, east to west of the country a few years ago to do work for a pitch for PG Tips, which was absolutely fascinating about the differences that exist within our relatively small island. And so, yeah, I'd say in answer to your question, start doing your desk research, start asking the audience that you find closest to you to form some initial hypotheses, but don't hold those hypotheses too close to your chest. Be open to go out, expand your search for knowledge and insight, or as sort of David Ogilvy would have said back in the day, you know, become that pig that's hunting for truffles, and you know, go and speak to people, and also then obviously online as well. You can do some interesting searches about what people are saying online, which may give you even more of a clue as to what they're really thinking, because probably in most cultures as well, certainly in British culture, we're quite reserved when people ask questions of us, and we tend to give the answers that we think that they want to hear. So, you know, even doing sort of Reddit shower thoughts or deep dives into what, you know, the really hardcore fans or fan groups are saying about certain things is kind of fascinating as well.
And here, the places they say is that they go is not Shoreditch, Brooklyn, but it's Faria Lima, which is to look what the executives are doing to check what
Oh,
is.
right, okay.
But the presentation that I've made the most after, I don't know, on the third year at Meta, because I spent 5 years over there, near 5 years. On the last 2 years over there was about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on advertising. So, and thinking about that as it is very connected to the culture, how can we have the creatives to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion on the advertising? Because there are a lot of stereotypes still there
Yeah.
are. It's moving forward. It's breaking a little bit of those. Like
Yeah.
cars, they used to be only driven by men on every campaign. Now we can see a little bit one brand or the other using men and women, but there's still a lot of
Yeah.
stereotypes. How can the strategies help the creatives to think about that?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, because I've had the benefit of working on Dove, which has been sort of at the forefront of being much more inclusive in its communications for a very long period of time. I think it was possibly 20 years or so that they've just recently celebrated since the campaign for Real Beauty was launched. Yeah, exactly. So I've had the benefit of kind of being part of that culture of, or part of that way of thinking, and working with a very international team as well, and a very diverse team, as you would have experienced in your time at Ogilvy. A lot of Brazilians still, though, which seem to seem to be a consistent theme in UK advertising. I think in the UK there is there has been a conscious effort to improve DE and I over the last sort of 5 years or so. And you know, I also benefit from kind of like being part of a community which is very diverse also. So I'm married to a woman who's from India. We have, you know, mixed race children. We are of a different religion to the majority of the country. And originally I'm from Wales, which is a small country sort of that people mistake as being part of England, but has its own distinct identity and culture as well. So I've always been very aware of that. I think the challenge that the industry have is sometimes it feels like it can be lazy. You know, the introduction of, you know, a different colored face, or a person of a different sexual orientation, or whatever the diversity it is. Those brands that get it right, and I think Dove is probably the exemplar of those, it feels very authentic, and it feels like they are committed to it. And I think you only have to sort of cast your mind back a year or so ago and what happened with Budweiser in the US to see how wrong certain brands can get it. And when it's tokenism, I think these days that people can see that, smell that, and feel it, you know, miles off, and will just, you know, veer away from those brands. I think there is a challenge at the moment that it's potentially another one of those passing trends, a bit like sustainability was a few years ago, and the industry, is very fickle at picking up at trends and then moving on from them. So again, I'd watch out that brands need to stick to a core set of values and beliefs and execute those consistently, a la Dove, over time in order for it to be, truly meaningful. But I don't think it's such an issue in the UK these days, because I think the UK is a melting pot of different races, nationalities, whatever you say, and they're all represented to greater or lesser extent in the communication that we see. I think the challenge for the industry now is within agencies to make sure that we get an adequate representation within agencies, to make sure that that is not just a passing fad, but it's something which is just embedded in the people that we work with day in, day out. It's easier to do in potentially bigger network agencies where you're working on multinational clients, and that's sort of my sweet spot and what I enjoy doing, and I love the interaction with all the different nationalities I work with. But it's something I think that we need to be aware of as an industry, and mindful of, when we're not just creating communications that the public sees, but within the agency structure, that we're seeing, a diversity of faces and opinions represented within our business, within our industry.
Yeah, the action, right? Not only the communication of the brand, but the action of the company.
Exactly. And I think it's so easy these days for people to see, is this fakery? Is this a brand? Is this a company who is trying to put on a voice or a face to suit a particular moment in time? These days, people go way beyond what is the superficial, and more power to them. I think it really demands, actions on behalf of those brands, businesses, and sort of agencies, industries, rather than just mere sort of words or pictures.
And on that, like the strategists could write something about that on the creative brief, or it's just on a meeting with the creatives. I keep thinking about Real Beauty. It was amazing, and it still is. So what could the strategists have done there that was different for the creative guys to think about that, the girls and guys, of course?
Well, although I'm old, I wasn't around when that original brief was written, but I think the insight, and it still keeps cropping up to this day, is that within the beauty category, there are large swathes of the population that don't recognize the imagery that advertisers pump out, and is reflective of who they are. So I think whether it's Dove, I'm working on a brief for a fragrance brand at the moment who's co-created some new scents with 6 very diverse young female influencers. The challenge is to authentically embrace those audiences and to actively encourage those sorts of briefs into the agency, and as part of, in the case of this fragrance brand, product development.
And on the presentations and studies that it used to do for Meta to the creative agencies here in Latam, was presented that I believe that 4,000 different campaigns were analyzed, and less than 1% of the ads had someone with disabilities, physical disabilities, and less than 1% LGBTQ+. So a very lack of representation as well from Black people. Some ads, I believe 18% had Black people, but without representation. They were just part of the ad. So there are a lot of things that we can do and break the stereotypes, like the objectified woman and things around that.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing brief, right? That to make sure that you're not falling back into cliches and narrow stereotypes, irrespective of whatever categorization you're giving them with. So the work isn't ever done.
And I'm studying sustainable marketing and thinking about doing presentations on that as well. So how do you believe that the clients see that today, sustainable marketing, to think about that on the actions and the communication of the brand, of course, avoiding greenwashing?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's an interesting, perhaps oxymoron, isn't it? And I, with the professor who I referenced at the very beginning of this podcast, in the in the early 1990s, I wrote my dissertation on the greening of consumerism and its effect on marketing strategy. And I remember him asking the question of me, which I probably wasn't intelligent enough even then to answer accurately. But he said, aren't these two things in conflict? So, consumerism is inherently about buying more stuff, consuming more stuff, whereas the growing ecological environmental crisis we're facing means that we have to dial that down. So I'm not sure I have the answer for you, Rafa. It's one that I think the whole world is struggling with at the moment. I think there are claims, of course, that brands can make about not using plastics, but then you look at the actual numbers, and I heard a terrifying stat last week that the amount of plastic in the world is due to grow sort of 50-fold. I think it was, I probably got that statistic wrong, but certainly an order of magnitude over the next 30-40 years or so. So you think, on the one hand, the message is saying one thing, but the actions globally are very different to the messages that are being put out. I think for most audiences now, there is a sense, certainly in a market like the UK, the US, probably even Brazil, that companies are thinking about their environmental impact and trying to take actions to mitigate that. I think there was a study done by some former colleagues of mine at Ogilvy. They talked about the say-do gap. So consumers say they want a greener planet, less global warming, more stable weather patterns, more stable crop production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they find it really difficult to minimize their impact with the current lifestyle that they have. So I think this is not an easy topic because on the one hand, as marketeers, we're trying to in the main try to drive growth for our brands. That's sort of why they appoint us, why they look to us to create the strategies and the work that is going to cause them to gain market share, to drive category growth in some instances. So it's not an easy circle to square for us. And as well as that, obviously, there's the environmental impact of the time that we're spending now talking to one another, of all the digital advertising, which has a huge carbon footprint, of all of the work that we're now currently doing on large language learning programs. So hopefully someone will invent a clean energy source that will allow us to do this guilt-free in a way, and not have such a devastating impact on the planet. But I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation and subject that is only going to grow louder over the coming years, rather than be another fad that kind of falls away from the marketing community.
And the last question, we have 6 minutes left over here on Zoom. So my last question is to think about my skills and how can I be better and reshape those. Which skills would you look, if you were hiring a strategist, which skills would you look for, not only the resume, but that the person have and to be part of your team?
Going back to and being careful also not to just try and recruit mini me's, because God knows the world doesn't need another version of me. But I think a natural curiosity and humility to picking up new knowledge, to asking sort of innocent but directive questions to get to new insights and to come up with interesting ways of thinking about things. Those would be the core things, which are, you know, almost timeless. It's just the way that we approach those challenges has changed quite markedly over the last few years or so. But that innate curiosity, that willingness to be sort of open and vulnerable, and to collaborate and engage with others, I think is the hallmark of a great strategist. Yeah. Mm.
I'm very curious. That's fantastic to learn and to think about my abilities as well. And I hope that it helps as well those who are listening and seeing, watching us now, that I'll share.
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe just to add to that, there are there's probably some technical skills, like how to, you know, in this new world of AI, how to write prompts, I think is going to be super important. You know, it's going to change quickly over the coming months and years, but yeah, how to translate that innate curiosity into something maybe more mechanical, which is the written word in the form of a prompt, I think is going to be interesting. And then, you know, just picking up on all the data that is available to us these days to try and make sense of what are the best ways of doing things. So, you know, I wish I had a sort of line from Walk and the IPA straight into my brain most times to kind of, you know, tell me the best way to optimize an answer for a client. But those resources are available, and you know, clients are increasingly looking to validate our thinking with examples of others. And you know, that also becomes an important discipline to have, like being able to contextualize your answer against the objectives that you're being set, being commercially savvy, and understanding that, you know, there are probably new ways to drive growth, new audiences, new channels, new moments, etc. And that also requires that curiosity and the willingness to be brave and come up with new answers to old problems.
I will look to my abilities to engage on those prompts. Well, thanks a lot, Mark. It was
You're
amazing
welcome.
to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you again, Rafa.
Thanks for your time, and a big hug for you on UK.
Likewise.
Yeah, just give a big hug for London as well. I miss it.
I will do. All right. Take care, Rafa.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.